Jasmine 2 is pretty awesome, and one thing I really love about the Pivotal Labs documentation for Jasmine is that they use this sort of a living documentation way of describing their code, and that basically means that like as you're going through it, you can see the Jasmine code that's executing, and you can also get some explanatory text next to it. What's really cool about this, you can see the code, but it's actually being executed at the bottom of the page. If we scroll all the way down, we can see what the Jasmine HTML reporter does. And it's ran 69 of 70 specs. One of them is set to be pending specs, actually one described with three sub specs inside of there. And so what's really cool is, this HTML page is actually running all the code here. So I just want to take that and I want to run it in the command line. So I'm just going to open up the console there, and it's called the introduction.js. And I'm actually just going to copy and paste this and put it in a file right there. I'm going to use what I've got up and running with WF grunt to just run this Jasmine 2 spec. So let's go ahead and do grunt test. Now we see a bunch of failures. That's actually because WF grunt doesn't support Jasmine 2. Not yet, anyway. It only supports Jasmine 1.3. We saw that not all the specs passed because some of them were using Jasmine 2 syntax and some of them were using Jasmine 1. I didn't show you in the video, but actually I grabbed from Jasmine 1.3 page, I grabbed those specs as well. So same thing, open up the console and introduction.js and just grabbed all of the specs that are executing on the page there and put them in a file locally. And so I just want to run those, and if I just listed the test directory, I've got this Jasmine 1 intro spec, Jasmine 2 intro spec. So I'm going to use this handy -- filter argument and just run the Jasmine 1 intro spec file. And because those are all Jasmine 1.3 and that's from the README, the documentation, they should of course all pass at the beginning. And we see that the grunt tasks all pass, and it opens up the web page, and then the HTML runner for all those specs pass as well. So I'm going to go ahead and Control-C and stop the watch on those specs. And you can see basically the WF grunt supports Jasmine 1.3 syntax, and when we try and run specs with Jasmine 2 syntax, a lot of them actually pass, but there's a number of changes. And the great resource for seeing what's changed, of course, is the Jasmine documentation itself. So when you go there and then go to the upgrading.js, will actually give you all of the changes between 1.3 and 2. So there's changes to custom matchers, which are not as commonly used in my experience. Some nice changes to asynchronous specs. So the big thing is now you can pass in if you provide an argument to before each, after each, or it will assume that that's a callback, typically called done, and it's just invoked when whatever asynchronous is running is finished. So it just follows the typical give me a callback when you're done asynchronous style. That's the same as Mocha, the Mocha JavaScript testing framework does, and it's a pretty convenient way to go. So that's change. There's also some other asynchronous things that have changed in terms of moving the clock forward when you want to do like a set interval. So we'll visit that a little bit later. Some other things have changed with spies, also known as mocks. Just the syntax. It used to be and call through and call fake as one word, and now it's split into and dot. I'm not a particular fan of that style, but I guess more and more is going that way. Luckily, the longer assertions or matches haven't changed, so to have been called with is not, to.have.been.called.with, which I think would just be crazy. So a little bit other has changed, but I'll visit that as we kind of go through the specs. So speaking of specs, let's, instead of looking at the Jasmine 1.3 or Jasmine 2 provided specs, let's create some of our own. So I have actually created a project or a module called a document viewer. And the idea here is just that you want to view some sort of document, and so you would tell it, okay, document viewer, load that document, and we're just keeping it simple here so there's no arguments, and it's just going to internally call, get a page, maybe it gets one page at a time, and it's an asynchronous function, so it's going to take a callback, and then it's going to do some, request to the server to get that page. We're just going to fake that by calling set timeout, and after a second it's going to call that done callback, and when that is done, then this callback here is what's called, and it's just going to call the internal callback, which seems like a bit of misdirection or indirection here, and there's good reasons for that. I want to show how to mock that in the tests because you'll often run into this in real code. So the self.callback, that's actually referring to a callback that was registered by sort of an observable or a function that takes a callback and then uses that from there on out as an indicator that an event happened. Not quite the event emitter pattern, but more of an observable type pattern. So the idea is the usage, you create a new document viewer, and in the constructor here, we get set up with a function that takes a callback, and when you're giving it a callback, it'll actually register it, so that when you call the load function, it will get a page asynchronously, then it will call that internal callback after 1 second or after this long-running process is finished. Now, one more thing to make note of here is that I'm using this define, and that's a require.js style, AMD style, and so because we're using WF grunt, it's already set up with require.js, and it just simplifies how things are work if we stick with the require.js style. So I've already started a spec, and that's also in the require.js style. So first I'm actually going to require in that document viewer class, a module that I created over there. And you see this async spec here. You can kind of ignore that for now, but it will show us a little bit of what Jasmine 2's done callback style looks like. It allows us to, with Jasmine 1.3, provide a done callback, which makes asynchronous testing a little bit easier, I think. So we have the typical Jasmine describe. We're going to describe the document viewer module. And this is where we create this async or set ourselves up so we can do asynchronous coding in more of a Jasmine 2 style. So we just require in this async spec module, and I'll open that up for you actually. There it is. So async spec, it's actually also known as Jasmine async, and this is a huge thanks to Derek Bailey, who's provided this, especially with the MIT license there, and I just modified it a little bit so it's wrapped in our typical require.js AMD header. It's pretty smart and simple. So what it does is you do it inside of a describe block, and you pass this in. This becomes the spec. And then it turns the old, well, it allows you to give a done callback function, and then it just, in the before each and the after each, and even in the specs, it just wraps that done callback in a runs and waits for block, which was the old Jasmine 1.3 style of doing asynchronous code. And so it just really simply, with 50 lines of code, allows you to use this more modern and easier to understand way of do asynchronous testing. And so let's just look at an example of that there. So I created the async spec, and then basically allows you to just call async.id or before each or after each. And you can see that I'm passing it a done argument there. And then I'm doing something asynchronous, and at the very end calling done, and that just indicates to the runner that it's finished all the asynchronous tasks and it can finish that spec. Before we get to that though, I just wanted to make a note that You know, sometimes when you're doing asynchronous things, the best thing to do is to actually just skip the long-running stuff. So this first spec is actually, we want to describe document viewer and the load function. And what we want it to do is call this on-page received callback when it's done doing what it's doing. So we do some setup here, create a new viewer, and we're actually using Jasmine's spy instead of doing a anonymous or a named function here and then maybe setting that when it's called there's some boolean that gets set to true. We're just going to use Jasmine's spies. So when we want to create a freestanding function, we just use Jasmine create spy. So then this on page received is going to take that function, and of course that's an observable pattern. So when we've received the page from the server, this will just invoke the function that it's been given, presumably if our code is correct. And the other thing that we want to do is we know that viewer.load, which we're going to call down here when we do our act part of the test, we know that viewer.load is going to call viewer.getPageAsync. So what we're going to do here is we are going to spy on that call, this particular object's getPageAsync, and instead of allowing it to run, and I'll go back to the code so you can see what it's doing, it's just faking a long-running process, and then at the end of it is going to invoke the done callback. So instead of letting that run, let's just call a fake function and provide that fake function. So that fake function has got to be similar. It takes a callback, and then instead of doing a set timeout or an asynchronous request that takes a while, let's just invoke that callback immediately. So that means when viewer.load is called, then viewer.getPageAsync should be called, and inside of that, the callback should be invoked immediately. So we would expect that our page received callback has been called at this point, and this has all been basically done synchronously, even though it started out as an asynchronous process. So let's just run these specs and verify whether they're actually succeeding or failing. And you can see we've got some failures here. This is actually because we're using some Jasmine 2 syntax below. So I'm going to ignore that and just do a force, and that'll finish the rest of the process and open up the HTML window so we can see the specs running in the browser. All right, so 5 specs, only 1 is failing. Now we might say, how do I know that this is actually running correctly? Well, this expectation here has to be true. So if we didn't, for instance, call the callback and we ran this code, and you can see WF grunt conveniently has a watch going and is rerunning these tests, and now we have 2 failing specs. The first one because expected spy unknown to have been called. Now if I want to give this spy a name, like page received callback, I can see a little bit more informative message in the output from Jasmine here. Expected spy, page received callback to have been called. We've seen that there's a spec for turning that asynchronous process into a synchronous process. And now we have another spec that again is using this Jasmine async or async spec library to provide us this done callback. So let's do this asynchronous process, and we'll let it actually run the set timeout code and wait for a whole second. And then we will expect we'll expect that callback to have been called. So we do the setup again, creating the new document viewer, and then we are basically subscribing to this observable with this callback function. And if this callback function is called, then we want to tell the test that it is finished asynchronously. So we just invoke the done callback. You might wonder why I did an expectation here, and actually it's totally unnecessary, but sometimes it's nice to just have some expectation inside of there. Otherwise other testing frameworks will complain that there's no expectation or no assertion. We might want to convince ourselves though that this test isn't just passing because it is perhaps skipping this callback and just finishing. So if we comment out the done and we rerun the test, then we can actually see it's taking longer to run the test here, and we should see a timeout. So Jasmine has a default 5-second timeout, and so because the done callback was not invoked within 5 seconds, that test just failed. And you can increase the timeout. In fact, I'm doing that in the next spec, but you can only do it so far, and eventually a test will fail if you don't actually indicate that the asynchronous stuff is finished. Okay, so that is a spec using the Jasmine async or async spec library. There is the old Jasmine 1.3 way of running though, and that was this runs and waits for syntax. And it basically was a way of setting up the control flow for asynchronous things so that they happen one after the other, but they're non-blocking. So for this one, I just wanted to update the timeout so we can play around a little bit with that. And then again, we have the setup, and we've got a Boolean so that we know when this on-page receive callback is actually called, and so it'll only be set to true if we do get this this callback. So we're calling viewer load, same as before, and now we're using this waits for syntax. So you give it an anonymous function, and it will poll it every so often. And when that function returns true, in this case, that will only happen when our callback has been called. Then this block will continue, and it will do the next runs or waits for asynchronous block. So this runs, what's inside of there will not actually execute until this waits for has returned a true. And we're going to give it a whole 6 seconds to run, and if it hasn't run in 6 seconds, then we'll get this error message appear and the spec will fail. So that spec is already succeeding right now. We can see that in the test runner. And let's go back here. So that would be, should get the page asynchronously the old way. Let's just filter on that one so only that spec is running. And let's see how exactly this asynchronous stuff is looks to be executing. So if we are on this spec right here, and we want to say, okay, this callback here, we're kind of interested when that might be executed, and let's see, we want to ensure that this expectation was actually hit. So let's refresh the page there. And now we can see our on-page receive callback was called. That set it to true. And so then our waits for returned within 6 seconds. And now we got our expectation here. And of course, that was set to true here. Now, what if we want to make that spec take longer than 6 seconds and fail? And remember, we've set the default timeout interval to 10 seconds now rather than the 5 that it used to be. So let's just change the actual source code here to, instead of return in 1 second, let's make sure that takes 15 seconds for it to run. And now we're going to see that in the command line first that it is just running and it's waiting, and we had one asynchronous spec fail because it didn't return, and now the second one. So the first one was waiting for the default of 5 seconds. The second one, this one right here, was waiting specifically for 6 seconds. And you see that one timed out as well. So this is the Jasmine 1.3 runs and waits for style of asynchronous testing. There's another style in Jasmine 1.3, and it's also in Jasmine 2, although the syntax has changed a little bit, and it's basically clock manipulation. So I've done a nested describe here, and let's go back to the HTML runner and run, run all of the specs. So in order for all those specs to not take too long, let's return back to only doing a 1 second wait for our get page async. And now we want to focus in on this nested describe for clock manipulation 1.3. So let's just click on that. And you can see that that's actually succeeding right now. as we'd expect it to, because we returned our code to its previous state. So what this does basically is that Jasmine can take over the set interval and set timeout and clear interval, clear timeout window functions. And so the way to do that is to use a before each, and that again will run this block of code before each it statement inside of this describe. And so we do Jasmine, the Jasmine global object dot clock use mock, and that just sets up all of these overrides for set interval and clear interval. And now to actually, the benefit of that, of course, is that you can then make your asynchronous stuff happen more quickly and not have to do, a done callback or runs and waits for. So the way that we do that is actually do a tick on the clock. So instead of runs and waits for, we're going to say viewer.load is called, our callback should be set to true, and then instead of waiting asynchronously, we're just going to tell the clock to advance by 1001 milliseconds. So because the source code is actually only doing a set time for 1000 milliseconds, we should have hit the set timeout and called the callback, and so we expect that the callback was called. And so that code, obviously, the test passes, so that is working, and let's just verify that that will fail if we don't wait long enough. And now you can see that expected false to be truthy. So not a very descriptive way of saying it, but let's just say callback to be called. And now callback to be called is added to there. A little bit more description of what's going on. So that's how you just advance the clock by certain amounts, and it's cumulative. So if you had multiple callbacks and multiple set intervals, you could just keep doing a clock tick, clock tick, clock tick. So that was clock manipulation in Jasmine 1.3. It's changed a little bit for Jasmine 2, and this is the last spec we have here, and that's actually the one that's failing in all these runs because it's the new Jasmine 2 syntax. You can see it's because undefined is not a function, of course, with Jasmine clock. So instead of in Jasmine 1.3 syntax where we do Jasmine clock use mock, and we only need to do it in the before each, in Jasmine 2 you have to install and uninstall the clock. And instead of a capital clock object, you are calling a function and receiving some sort of clock. So a little more maintenance in Jasmine 2. I'm sure they did that to simplify their code. But essentially it's the same after you change the case, turn it into a function. And so clock.tick is actually acts just the same between Jasmine 2 and Jasmine 1.3. So just mind that change in the syntax and you'll be good to go. So that was a somewhat long-winded just description of Jasmine 1.3 and Jasmine 2 using WF grunt and some of the changes between Jasmine 1.3, which WF grunt supports, and things you have to change to get Jasmine 2 to work, and just some intermediate steps that can help you along that path, that being the Jasmine async library that lets you start using the done callback with your Jasmine 1.3 code. And just did an example here with a document viewer that does some asynchronous stuff and just shows you the different ways that asynchronous testing can be done in Jasmine 1.3 and how that's changed in Jasmine 2. And I hope it's been informative. Please leave me comments, questions, any feedback that you would like to provide. I appreciate it, and thanks for watching.